Please be seated. The prophets always have a way of catching our attention. Malachi is considered the final of the 12 minor prophets. And the author maybe was not necessarily named Malachi. That word in Hebrew means the messenger. Likely, by the time Jesus and John are learning their scriptures, this book has been around for about 500 years. Meanwhile, in our gospel reading from Luke, John quotes from the prophet Isaiah, which would have been around for about 600 years at the time John is learning his scriptures. The section that John quotes comes from Isaiah 40. This is the beginning of what's known as the exilic author of Isaiah. It comes from a period in exile when the people had been liberated, but were still listening for God's message regarding the next stage of their journey. So today we have three prophetic figures: Malachi, Isaiah, and John, spanning millennia, calling us to listen, to wait, to watch for God's inbreaking in the world. But then we also read from Paul's letter to the Philippians. Now, even the earliest surviving manuscripts we have come from centuries after Paul lived. So while Paul would have been writing in the decades after Jesus' death, the manuscripts themselves are from about 200 years later. Our messages truly span millennia. And here we are, another 1,800 years after even those manuscripts, and we're still called to find meaning and to discern God's message from the prophets for us now. Malachi spoke to an audience that had returned from exile. Yet they had fallen away from God, and they began to doubt God's justice. And Malachi has to remind them that they have not been faithful themselves. He writes to help correct their lapse in religious observance. Malachi writes to remind them that God's justice is coming, but we also have a role to play. Isaiah prophesied to people in exile. They were in an ambiguous, uncertain time. Where was God leading them? How long would this last? How would they survive? Where will they end up? And Isaiah writes that the people have behaved unrighteously. They had cast aside the poor and the marginalized. And in the book of Isaiah, there's also something interesting. Isaiah says, rather than God's work being due to a covenant with Israel, that the people will know justice because God's self, is just and righteous, not conditional on a promise. So Isaiah preaches that it is because of God's holiness that God will show justice. John shares from Isaiah's prophecy. And this is a means of reaching his own audience, people who are living amid political heavyweights. They're trying to navigate a world that is not necessarily kind or compassionate to the lowly and the poor. John's audience is people who are on the margins. While not in a wandering exile, they certainly would have felt like outsiders to the powerful in society. Luke relies on the historical context of John to help us contrast God's work between the powers of politics and God's power. So Luke places John in history. This year, with these rulers, with these priests, through John, through his followers. So these prophets, they're considering who is hearing God's message, what is going on in their lives, and here we are, still discerning all of that, and how God's message differs for us, and how it differs for us from our own usual messages of power. So perhaps it's hopeful to consider that over the span of several millennia, we are still discerning God's messages. We are still waiting. We are still watching. And we are still trusting God's justice. And also maybe that's hard. We are still doing all of that. And we're still doing it because we still see the poor pushed aside. Because we still see the housed being made invisible. Because we still admire the powerful for their power over others. And we still celebrate wealth made from oppression. We still ascribe status in exclusionary ways, claiming an insider achieved only by proving worth based on money and titles. And we still live with barriers to community and a suspicion of anyone who doesn't look right. In several millennia, we have not solved homelessness, we have not fixed starvation, nor have we created accessible ways of healing the sick. So it's easy to read the prophets and wonder what has been going on for thousands of years of human history. When will we actually know God's justice? Each of our prophets spoke to groups who were wondering the same thing. When is God's time going to come? When will we see every valley filled, every mountain and hill made low, and the crooked made straight, and the rough ways made smooth? Paul's readers were beginning to come to terms with the realization that Jesus maybe wasn't coming back in their lifetime. They thought Jesus would return quickly and lay out God's justice, completely transform the world. And they're having to rethink the idea of how is God's presence coming through to us. In fact, it's interesting because in Paul's letter to the Philippians, we start to see a more cosmic view of Jesus. In between the readings from Philippians today and the readings next week, there's what's called the Christ poem in chapter 2. And we see an incarnational Christology which believes Jesus existed before his physical incarnation. A celestial being who chose to become human. Seeing Jesus cosmically is how this early group of Christians started to understand the time frame for Christ differently, and helped them see their relationship with God and Christ differently too. So again, what does it mean for us to read the prophets today? To consider a cosmic Christ and consider God's call to love. We can understand the history and the context of the situations of the prophets, but that does not leave their message explicitly to their circumstance. We can understand the continuity of the human condition across time and place, spanning millennia and geography, and we can see the relevance of their messages in our modern society. And we can reflect on our own personal need for the message of transformation and the call to awareness of God's presence in our own lives. So I wonder, where do you see the message of the prophets? The message of God not working through normal means of power, but working in the margins. The message of a call to readiness. The message of reorienting to God's love. the message of God's justice, a warning to the powerful and a hope to the poor. Where do you see rough ways made smooth? Because I think we do see it. And I think that we can choose to participate in it. Thinking of Jesus cosmically, not just historically, and reflecting on justice as essential to God, not contextually based on a government. It helps us to witness how alive the message of the prophets is, even today. I worked for a summer with the San Francisco Night Ministry. This is a 50-year-old organization that provides pastoral care at night to the unhoused in the Tenderloin, the Mission, Castro, and the Haight neighborhoods. From 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., I would walk by myself through one of those neighborhoods and be a listening ear, a prayer partner, a compassionate presence for whatever anyone needed to share. And I heard a lot of heartbreaking stories. Teenagers kicked out of homes because of their sexual orientation. Adult children evicted when their parent died, losing their only home. Elderly unhoused because of unexpected medical debt. After hearing stories of economic displacement, abuse, and neglect, I would walk back to the ministry office and I would walk past a mural that read, "Today was a good day." And at first, this really bothered me. In the heart of the Tenderloin, this potentially toxic, positive message. But every night, I loved my work. And it truly was a good day. It was a good day because people were in relationship with one another. It was a good day because people worked together and looked out for one another. It was a good day because there was listening and there was storytelling. The rough way was made smooth because people were together seeing each other. Valleys are filled when we choose to see Christ's light in the other. The mountains and hills are laid low when we listen to one another. The crooked paths are made straight when we share our burden with a friend. It is a good day, not because everything is fixed. It is a good day because we are in it together. The inbreaking of God cannot force the changes in our human conditions. We have responsibility to make the world a better place. But God's justice is alive every time we strive for the belonging of all God's children and live according to the hope that love does change the world. Advent highlights the experience of waiting and watching, which means something different to us several millennia after Jesus, after the prophets. Yet as we practice a stewardship of love, the watching and the waiting shifts from watching and waiting for something outside of us to fix things, to instead noticing the stirring of God's justice within us. And we are waiting only on ourselves to make the choice to make today